What does it mean to be alive? And what things are living and what isn't? What about water, a tree, a rock, the rock? Which of these things are living and which of these aren't? Well, a long time ago, before microscopes, the difference between living things and non-living things was a little bit blurry, and scientists were curious of what makes something alive versus not alive. And if you Google what makes something alive, you're probably going to get some characteristics such as this. It grows, it reproduces, it adapts to the environment, it uses energy, and it produces waste. And those are all good descriptions of things that are alive, but actually all of those could probably be met with fire. Because yeah, fire does grow, it kind of spreads and keeps making more fire, so we could say it reproduces. If there's an area that's wet and one that's more burnable, it's kind of adapting to where it will survive best, using up the energy in the wood to burn and kind of leave some waste behind as ash. And before we go further, it's important to note that the consideration of what is living and what is not varies by culture and religious beliefs. You are free to hold your personal belief of what is alive. This video is not meant to challenge your beliefs. This video will discuss the classification of life from a scientific perspective for the purpose of assistance with scientific courses. So by scientific definition, is fire alive? No. By scientific definition, fire is not alive because it's missing this key piece that I didn't put up earlier. Made of cells. Scientifically, we classify anything that's living is going to be made of cells. How do we get there? How did scientists determine that to be alive, it has to be made of cells? Well, in this video, we're going to look at the progression through many scientists of how we went from spontaneous generation, life forming from non-life, to life being made of and forming from cells. This is called the cell theory, and it's what this video is about. So let's take a look at the development of cell theory. Okay, so way back before we knew anything about cells, scientists noticed that life seems to just grow. And you've probably witnessed this if you've seen anything mold or any type of food go bad. It looks like this life, this mold, or even bugs just seems to kind of pop out of nowhere. It doesn't really seem like there's something that started it. It just seems like it grows from nothing. And that was actually kind of what our initial conclusion was. Life can just form out of nothing. And there was a name for this called spontaneous generation. I have my moldy bread there. It seems like the mold just came out of nowhere. So this is life spontaneously forms from non-life or non-living things. And this was also termed abiogenesis. And it's kind of our starting point for where it appeared that life was coming from. But now we'll begin to take a look at scientists that studied this more to see where that life was coming from. And our first one is Redi's experiment. Redi's experiment, he had this meat or this food that he knew often grows mold and maggots and gross stuff like that. And he put it in a jar and he sealed the top and he left it be. And in that scenario, nothing really grew. There was probably a little bit, but there wasn't any really significant life there. So we're gonna chalk that one up to being no life. The next one is he covered it with a gauze, which basically meant that air could pass through, but it's gonna stop any bugs from getting in. So we can see here, flies and stuff could try and get in because they're smelling the food, but they can't actually pass into the jar. In this scenario, it didn't grow much either. The meat seems to be pretty much unaffected there. And in the last scenario, we have nothing on the top. It says flask open. And in that case, yeah, the meat grew a lot of mold, it grew a lot of kind of maggots and flies and gross stuff like that. So what can he conclude from this? He said, well, it only was able to really grow the most life if the flies were actually able to get in to the jar. So it's kind of concluded, well, maybe the flies go in there, they lay their eggs, and that's how we're gonna start getting life. Life had to get in initially, and it was able to reproduce off of that source of energy or that meat. So the conclusion from his experiment was not that life came out of nowhere, but life comes from other life. The flies had to get in there to start the life growing. Life didn't pop out of nowhere like spontaneous generation, it comes from other life. Our next scientist is Pasture, and his experiment wasn't using meat, it was using this kind of like a broth. You can imagine kind of like soup, but there's no chunks of stuff in there, just the broth or the liquid part. And he boils it off the start so that any type of bacteria in there is killed. It's starting with no life. We're gonna start with no life in there, okay? And then what he does after he boils it, he has two experiments here. The first one, he just takes it off, lets it cool and leaves it, but it's got this kind of weird top. to the top of the beaker. It's called like a swan neck. It's got this big S in it. Okay. But the other one, he breaks that off, so it's just open. It's a small opening, but it's open at the top, and he's just gonna leave them both and see what's gonna happen. So he leaves the one on the top for a while. Nothing really happens there. Not really much life or mold grows in that one, but in the bottom one, it does. A significant amount of life and mold and gross stuff grows in that one. So he thinks, well, what's the difference between these two? I'll grab my pen here. We theorize that, well, maybe there's tiny little life that's really hard for us to see with our eyes. And if it was able to get into that tube, it would all kind of collect down here, and it wouldn't really be able to get to the broth. It would be stuck in that swan neck. However, if that type of small life existed and it fell in here, I can show it going down inside the beaker, it would be able to get to the broth, and that's a food source, and it can replicate and it can get larger. So it's kind of similar to Redi's experiment, and they were saying, well, if life couldn't get in there, it's not going to grow, but if life could get in there, that's where we're going to see more. So a similar conclusion that life comes from other life, but maybe it's just really small. We don't see actually flies going in. Maybe there's some really small life in the air that we have to take a closer look at. And that leads us to our next four scientists. And to look at this really small life, we need microscopes. Now we need to start looking at things smaller to get a better indication of what's going on down there. So our first scientist to use a lens to try and zoom in on really small things is Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke is where we're going to start the idea of looking at small things. He had a very old, simple microscope, but he was able to learn some pretty interesting things with it. He took a look at a piece of cork, and this is what he saw. Take a look at a piece of cork, and he saw all these little squares that you can hopefully see there. And he imagined them kind of like tiny little rooms. And I kind of try to imagine maybe like a prison where they've got all these little tiny rooms where people are sleeping and they're kept, because prison's not a great place. But anyway, we're thinking of all these tiny rooms where people are kept. And he thought, well, these tiny rooms, let's call those kind of like a prison, let's call them cells. And he was the first one to see these tiny rooms, cells, and give them the name cells. That's his contribution to cell theory. He's the first one to come up with that name of cell and see these tiny rooms. Our next contribution comes from scientist Leeuwenhoek. I'm trying to say that best I can. Hopefully that's not too bad. His contribution was he looks through a microscope and sees cells, but he sees them wiggling around. He describes them as prettily moving. They talked a little bit different back then. And this is the contribution of not just looking at dead cells, but seeing living cells. That was our contribution here. Our next contribution comes from two scientists, Schleiden and Schwann. I think that's how you say them. Doing my best here. I hope it's not too bad. Their contribution is they're looking at a whole bunch of living things. They got a whole bunch of animals, a whole bunch of plants, and they see that animal cells look a little bit different than plant cells, but when you look at any animal or plant, they all seem to be made of cells. So all living things, plants and animals, seem to be made of cells, is from these two scientists. And our last scientist for this video, I'll do my best to pronounce his name right, Virchow is I believe how you say it, and he looked at something really interesting because he was looking at cells, but he was able to watch them for a little while and notice that as you watch it for a little while, they start to kind of grow and kind of get bigger and begin to kind of split apart and eventually split into two new cells. And this was big because just as Redi and Pasture had said life comes from other life, we saw before, now we're saying living things are made of cells. Well, this shows that cells come from other cells. So this kind of fits the life coming from life, but now cells coming from cells, and that completes our idea on cell theory. So let's sum up what cell theory is. It's also called biogenesis. Spontaneous generation was abiogenesis. That's what we started with. And now we've transitioned to cell theory, which is biogenesis. So the three main parts of cell theory for our conclusion is the smallest unit of life is one cell. Anything smaller than that is not considered living. And it's going to be the unit of all living things. So the next one here, all life is made of at least one or more cells. Organisms like humans and dogs made of lots and lots and lots of cells, but you can have life that is just one cell big. And the last part here from Virchow is all cells come from other cells. So that's how we went from spontaneous generation through a whole bunch of scientists to cell theory. That's all we have for this video, so I hope that helped you to understand those scientists and their contributions to cell theory. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.